It is Monday, May the 13th, 2019. This is the Dissident Peasant podcast, and I am your host, Jeff from Georgia. On today's show, Mary G. Harris, better known as Mother Jones. That's right, the miners' angel, the union organizer, the IWW founding member, and mother to millions. Yes, though Mother's Day was yesterday, we're doing her today. Sorry about that. But of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that today's show, like all these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you. We've gone to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Become a recurring donor for as little as $1 a month. You know, a lot of podcasts, they brag about being off the cuff, unplanned, unedited. I've never understood this. I do my best to craft something for you that I think is a little bit polished and a little bit good. So, if you appreciate that, go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Chip in. There's a PayPal button, too. You can check my Twitter, the website, dissidentpeasant.com. If you want to throw in a little bit more web hosting bill, just hit my bank account. So, please and thank you for your contributions and your attention. So, before I begin with my own introduction, because he did such a good job, and because they belong to the public domain now, I'll read to you the words of Clarence Darrow, of course the lawyer and leader in the early American Civil Liberties Union, from his introduction to the autobiography of Mother Jones. Quote, "This little book is a story of a woman of action, fired by fine zeal. She defied calumny. She was not awed by guns or jails. She kept on her way regardless of friends and foes. She had but one love, to which she was always true, and that was her cause. People of this type are bound to have conflicts within and without the ranks." Mother Jones was especially devoted to the miners, the mountainous country, the deep mines, the black pit, the cheap homes, the danger, the everlasting conflict for wages and for life, appealed to her imagination and chivalry. Much of the cause of trade's unionism in England and America has been associated with the mines. The stories of the work of women and children in the mines of Great Britain are well known to all trade unions. The progress of trade unionism in England was largely the progress of the miners' cause. The fight in America has been almost a replica of the contest in Great Britain. Through suffering, danger, and loyalty, the condition of the miners has gradually improved. Some of the fiercest combats in America have been fought by the miners. These fights brought thousands of men and their families close to starvation. They brought contests with police, militia, courts, and soldiers. They involved prison sentences, massacres, and hardships without end. Wherever the fight was the fiercest and the danger the greatest, Mother Jones was present to aid and cheer. In both the day and the night, in the poor villages and at the lonely cabin on the mountainside, Mother Jones always appeared in time of need. She had a strong sense of drama. She staged every detail of a contest. Her actors were real men and women and children, and she often reached the hearts of employers where all others failed. She was never awed by jails. Over and over she was sentenced by courts. She never ran away. She stayed in prison until her enemies opened the doors. Her personal non-resistance was far more powerful than any appeal to force. This little book gives her own story of an active, dramatic life. It is a part of the history of the labor movement of the United States. Clarence Darrow, Chicago, June 6, 1925. End quote. Mary G. Harris Jones, Jones being her future husband's name, the woman who will become Mother Jones, was born sometime before August in 1837 in Cork, Ireland, to two tenant farmers. The exact date of her birth is unknown. Harris herself will later claim 1830 as her actual birth year in order to make herself seem yet older and therefore more mystical. She actually opens chapter 1, sentence 1 of her autobiography with this lie. Her father would soon depart for Toronto during her childhood, which as a part of the British Empire had no restrictions on his immigration there. He went there to work in the era's big industrial boom project, railroad construction, after taking part in an uprising against the landlords of his day in his native land. He will send for his family as soon as he can, for what they and young Mary were enduring as he worked and earned to secure passage for them was a horrific event simply called the Great Famine. During the spring and summer, when the days get longer and everything seems more alive, like now, I often think about Mother Nature. To muse upon her is literally timeless. That is, humans contemplating nature is older than humans contemplating time. And the first ways we marked time were by the movements of nature, the sun and the moon, the cycle of day and night, seasons and such. Mother Nature taught us time itself, and teaches us this still, in our names and calendars and seasons, and many other things. Whether we're hunting and gathering, or scratching in the dirt, or zipping to and fro in motorized vehicles, no matter how cunning our plans, or intricate our society, or seemingly great our technology, Mother Nature will always be there, always a teacher, for good or ill. She also teaches us about misfortune. So great was the confluence of factors that caused a completely avoidable catastrophe as the Great Famine. If only some people had done this and not that, or known this and not that. Her tools in this particular episode were many, but the smallest one, the most consequential one, and the one that approximately started the whole thing, was just a little bug. Phytophthora infestans, from Greek, loosely translated to something like plant-ruining destroyer, is a type of parasitic algae, often confused for a fungus, that owns the shit out of potatoes. And it started doing just that in Ireland around 1844. And this is kind of what I mean by misfortune, beyond this singular bug of a microscopic organism showing up and ruining your food. You see, this organism can only attack certain kinds of potatoes. So as long as we're in a society that understands something about genetic diversity in agriculture, and we grow different kinds of potatoes, we'll be okay. Oh, Ireland isn't that society in 1844. Well, okay, as long as we don't only grow potatoes, we'll be okay. Oh, the ability for potatoes to be both comparatively nutritious and grow abundantly in small plots of poor soil, combined with British market demand for beef, means that huge swaths of the population are basically only growing potatoes. Well, as long as the government responds appropriately and we don't export any food and we import food, we'll be okay. Oh, except Ireland is directly ruled as a colony by Westminster at this time, and they will continue to export food from Ireland for the duration of the famine, and the response from the ministry will be either inadequate or non-existent. And there are yet more factors, honestly, that led to the famine being so bad, and it's pretty plausible that if but one or two had been only slightly different, the whole thing might not have happened at all. Anyway, why am I bothering to tell you all this? Just to make the point that perhaps we should appreciate more just how the random forces of nature are responsible for our worldly education, and indeed what drives Mother Jones across the ocean. Specifically, how it can also often drive people into leftist modes of thought and political philosophy. Helen Keller, for example, I am convinced was in an important way a pioneer of human consciousness and politics in her day and in ours, even if she was a straight-up Bolshevik. Stricken as a baby with disease and therefore blind and deaf almost her entire life, she learned very early on that the only thing that makes life worth living is other people, and that we are all ultimately dependent upon each other for everything we have and everything we are. Thomas Paine, the ultimate fail-son who could not make his way in the world as a young man and just could not seem to find a decent job and keep it became incredibly interested in a social welfare state that didn't just feed its people, but helped them find purpose in their lives. Now, not all those stricken blind or deaf become communists, not all fail sons win a jobs program, and not all victims of the Irish Great Famine go on to become legendary labor organizers, of course. But in an era such as our own, fascinated with facts and not feelings, it's just a fact that feeling and experiencing something directly is sometimes what it really takes to learn your wisdom. Anyway, lesson thus imparted. As a teenager, young Mary made it to Toronto in Canada, where she learned how to make dresses and attended the Toronto Normal School. Normal schools are a moniker that's gone mostly out of style. This refers to norms of pedagogy, curriculum, and society that school teachers are expected to impart upon their students. Now, this role for education in society cuts its ways not beyond criticism, of course, and if you've ever met someone who complained endlessly about education being a factory of conformity, well, they are more or less right. And we're even more right back then, when we called schools normal. Though she did not graduate from the Toronto Normal School, she received enough instruction at it to procure a post first at a convent in Monroe, Michigan, and later a school in Memphis, Tennessee, with a short stint in Chicago in between. Now, her future as a seamstress, which she reports preferring to the work of bossing little children about, still lies mostly in her future. She was a mother and a homemaker when, as all things do, Mother Nature came round again, too young to have grasped exactly perhaps what was happening to Ireland and the Irish and her family as a child, and why. Mary could see all too clearly what happened next when the fever came to Memphis. Bronze John, the Yellow Jack, the American Plague, or its most popular name, yellow fever, is a viral infection that affects basically two kinds of creature, if you forgive my somewhat imprecise language, mosquitoes and primates, including humans. Now, today, a safe and effective vaccine for yellow fever does exist, but in 1867, when the plague hit Memphis, we were still over 3 decades away from even figuring out the disease was transmitted via mosquito bite. Additionally, then as now, there really is no direct treatment for the disease, no effective antiviral drugs. Countermeasures are either preventative, like mosquito control and vaccinations, or supportive, hydration, pain relief, immune system support. In fact, many people who used to get yellow fever often didn't even realize they had it. Most cases of infection would result in 3 to 4 days of fever, pain, nausea, fatigue, loss of appetite, stuff like that, but no jaundice or yellowing of the skin. And surviving the infection almost always brings lifelong immunity. However, in some cases of infection, a second and worse phase sets in, with harsher and more symptoms, most commonly liver damage, where the eponymous yellow comes from. And during this second phase, mortality rates can top over 50%. Memphis reported 2,500 cases of yellow fever in this outbreak in 1867 and 550 deaths. If you're thinking that's not so bad, well, you're kind of right. Worse outbreaks in Memphis would await the following decade, but in 1867 it was sort of a good news, bad news situation for Mary. The good news is we have pretty successfully quarantined the disease to a single area of town. The bad news is you, Mary, and your family are in that area. And so her world shrunk from a globe big enough to contain both her homeland and the Americas, past a map of the United States, past a map of Memphis, past a plan of Memphis, cursed city built upon a swamp, all the way down to her little home with just a few blocks outside. That became her entire world. In that little space, quote, schools and churches were closed. People were not permitted to enter the house of a yellow fever victim without permits. The poor could not afford nurses. Across the street from me, 10 persons lay dead from the plague. The dead surrounded us. They were buried at night quickly and without ceremony. All about my house I could hear weeping and the cries of delirium. One by one my 4 little children sickened and died. I washed their little bodies and got them ready for burial. My husband caught the fever and died. I sat alone through nights of grief. No one came to me. No one could. Other homes were as stricken as mine. All day long, all night long, I heard the grating of the wheels of the death cart. End quote. This lesson was not one in the universality of suffering, or the lesson that death is our universe's most democratic feature, though both these are true and you're better off knowing it. No, the yellow fever doesn't check your bank account before infecting you, true. She saw how the rich had escaped the city and fled north to where mosquitoes are not so multiple, and how, in that sense, wealth did indeed determine these things on the margins. Just as Helen Keller will later learn that blindness and deafness are not randomly distributed throughout populations, but concentrated in the lower classes. Anyway, after the plague had ended and her family mourned, the 30-year-old widow moved back to Chicago, where she had briefly wandered before, to support herself via dressmaking. She was actually quite good at it, too. She served the upper classes of Chicago during the 1870s with a business partner. I quote from our dear mother herself, quote, "I returned to Chicago and went again into the dressmaking business. We were located on Washington Street, near the lake. We worked for the aristocrats of Chicago, and I had ample opportunity to observe the luxury and extravagance of their lives, often while sewing for the lords and barons who lived in magnificence on the Lakeshore Drive. I would look out the plate-glass windows and see the poor, shivering wretches, jobless and hungry, walking along the frozen lakefront. The contrast of their condition with that of the tropical comfort of the people for whom I sewed was painful to me. My employers seemed neither to notice nor care. Summers, too, from the windows of the rich I used to watch. The mothers come from the west side slums, lugging babies and little children, hoping for a breath of cool, fresh air from the lake. At night, when the tenements were stifling hot, men, women, and little children slept in the parks. But the rich, having donated to the Charity Ice Fund, had, by that time, gone seaside into the mountains." End quote. All of this was interrupted by an event fairly well known, generally, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. After many weeks of consistently favorable weather conditions for wildfire, 3.3 square miles of Chicago, which was mostly made of wood and tar at the time, went up in smoke. Now, contrary to legend, it's not known whether the cows or lanterns were involved. We just don't know how it started, though we do know the thing started in a barn. This event would directly claim the lives of around 300 people, but left more than 100,000 residents of Chicago homeless, including Mary, whose shop and all her possessions were destroyed. Struck by catastrophe at least thrice now, by my counting, potato famine, plague, and fire, she was well acquainted in each of these instances where, despite Mother Nature seeming to lack a class consciousness, empirically speaking, it could be tough to tell. There was food in Ireland during the Great Famine, almost all of it foodstuff beyond the purchasing power of the vast majority of the people there. When the yellow fever struck Memphis, those who could afford to flee and live elsewhere did so. And when the fire came to Chicago, those with connections and reputations based upon their now former wealth had help and resources to draw upon, while she camped next to a lake with nowhere else to go. I cannot know if she was thinking exactly along these lines or not, but these experiences, coupled with her contact with organized labor through her husband's union, led her to this great crossroads in life. You see, in the late 19th century, for a widow such as her, in the eyes of many, there really should have been no choice for her at all, no other road to take. At best, a humble but dignified life as a spinster of modest means would have been the path most people would point her down. But Mary took off square in another direction and became something very peculiar for the time, a member of the Knights of Labor. A sort of proto-union of the 19th century, the Knights of Labor were at first less a union and more a kind of club in society, not so much into strikes or egalitarianism for women or racial minorities, etc. Now, they did improve on much of this during their lifetime as an organization, but their tendency towards conservatism and the demonstrated limits of their solidarity across lines of color, gender, and nationality, etc., would ultimately hamper their effectiveness and bleed their numbers out, as well as drive Mary away. But before that, for many, many, many years, they were the only game in town, and Mary lost her Xbox in the fire. Now, the fire had not taken Mary that October of 1871, though it had taken everything else. But that fire really was the beginning of the end for Mary Harris Jones, I think. in the beginning of Mother Jones. She begins traveling the country wherever there are nights of labor and trouble, including to Pittsburgh to support striking railroad workers, where she saw firsthand the both direct violence of the law and the literal false flag attacks against labor, when a bunch of locomotives and boxcars and shit were all doused in oil and lit on fire, and then the act was pinned on the strikers. During the 1870s and early 1880s, the strikes she went to sometimes succeeded, but were more often brutally suppressed by militia and cop. These were the days of saints and martyrs, as she told it. Still, there was also plenty of labor unrest in Chicago at the time for her to attend to. Labor unrest which culminated in one of the better-known miscarriages of justice, at least for all those who put themselves on the side of the downtrodden, the Haymarket Affair. Now, this police massacre and the events leading up to it, as well as its aftermath, I did my best to cover in a previous episode from a long time ago, so I won't belabor any of that here. But I will tell you that Mother Jones was, of course, hanging around Chicago at the time, at least according to her autobiography she was. Was she fraternizing with these anarchists? Was she one of them? Well, in her autobiography, the one that begins with a lie, and was written incredibly late in her life, for the record, when she recounts this time, she places herself next to the anarchists, but not with them, I'd say. She went to some of their meetings, supported their aims, but she was no bomb thrower herself. And she reports that she found their tactics overly provocative and counterproductive to public perception at the time, though you're going to have to decide whether or not you want to take her word on all this. However, in the end, she calls the men who died for all this martyrs and heroes, the correct take in my view. Bravo, Mary, and that really is the most important thing. Speaking of Mary, beginning around 1890, she basically becomes mother, and now is as good a time as any to tell you about that. Now, as I told you before, roles for women in American society during the late 19th and early 20th centuries were incredibly limited, both legally and socially. As far as we still have to go in our own time in achieving true equality in the dream of feminism, a dream that I share, you can imagine we were almost exponentially further behind in 1886. A woman's place in the world was defined by stereotype and prejudice, where to break these norms, depending on which norms you broke and how badly you broke them, could be dangerous or even deadly to you. So in response to this, Mary Harris Jones pulled a sort of judo move. She began to dress in black, covered up to her neck and down to her waist and ankles. She told people that she was 7 years older than she actually was. She wore her white hair in a tight knot. She was always a shorty at only 5 foot tall, and with a face that had aged pretty quickly in light of all the hardship it had seen, and so she played the grandmother all the time. With time, no one even will call her Mary anymore. She will not even have a permanent address. She will become a divine creature, in part because the world she lived in would not allow her to be a real person, because of her gender. She will become the miner's angel, mother to all, stronger than all the jails she was repeatedly thrown into, wiser than all the judges she drew a frown from, and wittier than all the enemies she ever inspired rage in. Mother Jones, as I will call her from now, though a friend to all who toiled and toil still, was most identified with the United Mine Workers, or UMW, starting in about 1890. In addition to simply having her arrested on spurious trumped-up charges, a common tactic of the time was the libertarians' favorite lever, property rights. When Mother Jones came to town, she stayed with the families of this laborer or that sympathetic family, and the deeds to these properties were often held by the very same men who controlled the town factory. She was frequently roused from sleep by agents of the landlord turning out the whole family in order to deny her a place to sleep, or being denied the use of church buildings on land owned by town barons. She was once informed that the African American church hosting her meetups would be destroyed if she continued to use it, and rather than bring the wrath of the white establishment down upon the heads of these innocent congregants, she would meet wherever else she could and bore the congregation no grudge for it, reportedly. And she never lacked for courage. More than once, pistols were drawn and aimed at her, Threats of hanging her shouted. Threats to murder her, both legally and not, all aimed at this tiny little woman, younger than she looked, but aged by the world she was now struggling with to make better, and she never stopped. In terms of the number of times she was arrested or exiled or held incommunicado by one body of law enforcement or military or another, she ranks near the top of the list, if not the greatest of all time. Her charisma and sense of drama made her nearly legendary, a folk hero for the industrial age, and a much-needed voice of inspiration in education, in an age when powerful interests did all they could to suppress those ideas. Or, as Mother Jones once put it, quote, "Taking men into the Union is just the kindergarten of their education, and every force is against their further education. Men who live up those lonely creeks have only the mine owners' YMCAs, the mine owners' preachers, teachers, the mine owners' doctors, and newspapers to look to for their ideas, so they don't get many." End quote. Now, we call her Mother Jones, so it is fitting that one of her better-known efforts culminated in something called the March of the Mill Children. According to the 1900 census, about 1/6 of all American children under the age of 16 were employed. And beginning in 1901, workers in Pennsylvania's silk mills began going on strike. The UMW, now finally in a position to pay her something for being so awesome, sent Mother Jones to encourage unity and solidarity among the workers, many of whom were young women demanding to be paid at the same rates as adults, and many of whom were young women who wanted to go to school. Though eventually a settlement was reached that did send the girls back to the mills, in 1903 the struggle resumed. Mother Jones was never going to be okay with child labor. This time she contacted the press and she told them that she had children with missing fingers and other horrific shit. The newspapermen informed her that the mill owners held stock in the papers, so getting anything like that published just wasn't going to happen. Mother Jones reportedly replied that she held stock in these little children and said that she would arrange a little publicity of her own. What happened next was a bizarre, if amazing, display. A children's crusade of workers and their families and sympathizers marching all the way from Kensington, Pennsylvania to President Theodore Roosevelt's personal house in New York City, about 100 miles. Complete with drums, fifes, and children in cages to dramatize how mill owners felt about their employees, and women wielding mops and brooms like samurai swords. They were rebuffed by the president's secretary, who recommended Mother Jones write a letter, which was then politely ignored. Meanwhile, the long, hard march and the toughness of striking for a long time without any wage, as well as factional disputes amongst the strikers, meant that the crusade was already beginning to fail, at least in that moment. It would take a couple years for Pennsylvania to pass and enforce decent laws regulating child labor, and it wouldn't be till after she was dead that Teddy's cousin Franklin's New Deal would pass the first nationwide legislation regulating child labor. But it was Mother Jones' amazing publicity that brought the cause much-needed attention at the time. Attention whose snowballing would lead to the reforms I just mentioned. Radical action is not the enemy, but the complement to liberal reform. She was actually arrested, charged, and sentenced to 20 years in prison for a similar stunt in West Virginia. She was 68 years old at the time and had pneumonia. It's lucky she received a pardon from the governor at the time, who was no friend of minors, but looking to differentiate himself from his predecessor's hard-headed response. Like any leftist worth their salt, Mother Jones had enemies, not just among states' attorneys and sheriffs and robber barons, but among lefties themselves. She was portrayed almost infamously as an anti-suffragist, an angle that media then and now, a little at least, is pretty eager to play up. In her own words in 1915, quote, 500 women got up at dinner and asked me to speak. Most of the women were crazy about women's suffrage. They thought that kingdom come would follow the enfranchisement of women. You must stand for free speech in the streets, I told them. How can we, piped a woman, when we haven't a vote? I have never had a vote, said I, and I have raised hell all over this country. You don't need a vote to raise hell. You need convictions and a voice. Someone meowed. You're an anti. I am not an anti to anything which will bring freedom to my class, said I. But I am going to be honest with you, sincere women who are working for votes for women. The women of Colorado have had the vote for 2 generations, and the working men and women are in slavery. The state is in slavery, vassal to the Colorado Iron and Fuel Company and its subsidiary interests. A man who was present at a meeting of mine owners told me that when the trouble started in the mines, one operator proposed that women be disenfranchised because here and there some woman had raised her voice in behalf of the miners. Another operator jumped to his feet and shouted, "For God's sake, what are you talking about? If it had not been for the women's vote, the miners would have beaten us long ago." Some of the women gasped with horror. 1 or 2 left the room. I told the women I did not believe in women's rights, nor in men's rights, but in human rights. No matter what your fight, I said, don't be ladylike. God Almighty made women, and the Rockefeller gang of thieves made the ladies. I have just fought through 16 months of bitter warfare in Colorado. I have been up against armed mercenaries, but this old woman without a vote, and with nothing but a hat pin, has scared them. Organized labor should organize its women along industrial lines. Politics is only the servant of industry. The plutocrats have organized their women. They keep them busy with suffrage and prohibition and charity. End quote. For all her rabble-rousing, she was never actually that much into violence or armed resistance, which you might have picked up on from the way I talked about her relationship with anarchism in the late 19th century. One of her more shameful incidents occurred in 1921, when she tried to stop a group of armed miners from marching in West Virginia, claiming to have received a telegram from President Warren G. Harding to end private police forces in West Virginia if the marchers demilitarized and went home. The United Mine Workers President Frank Keeney demanded to see the telegram. Mother refused to show it to anyone. For their part, the White House denies ever sending such a thing, and after being denounced as a fake, Mother Jones left the camp quite upset. In fact, so upset she basically got so sick she almost died. There was almost certainly no telegram, though I wouldn't put it past the White House to lie about such a thing to sow division amongst their enemies. And it's possible, if not probable, that she had her own reasons for not showing anyone the document, but I really doubt it, and so does basically everyone else who's looked into it. However, without besmirching her too badly, because I do admire and respect her a great deal, this is kind of the flip side of having such a keen sense of drama. Stories are more impactful, more true, in a sense, when some of the contradictory and less relevant bits are flaked away, and the dish seasoned with some poetic license. Mill owners didn't actually cage their employees, but it made for great visualization, right? Not that this is the same as that, just that it's often the case that those of us who become accustomed to storytelling should always take pains to get it right and tell the truth as best we can, without betraying our own principles or ignoring our own point of view, or making up anything. Mother Jones was the only woman who signed the IWW Charter in 1905. She continued to be active with the United Mine Workers Union her whole life, basically, and beyond life. She's actually buried in Mount Olive, Illinois, in the Union Miners Cemetery there, alongside miners killed in strikes that she once called her boys. You ever heard the old song, "She'll be coming round the mountain"? Well, the she who comes round the mountain in that old children's song was probably Mother Jones, traveling the coal camps of the Appalachian Mountains, shitting lightning and shouting thunder. She raised money and was a mother to the Mexican revolutionaries in the early 1900s. And in mine country, people delighted in telling stories of how she once pulled a gun on a company man from under her apron and could cuss like a goddamn sailor. However, she backed the losing side in the election of John Lewis to replace conservative AFL union leader and hated piece of shit Samuel Gompers, and the victorious Lewis was not going to keep her around the payroll for very long. Elliot Gorb, in his biography of Mother Jones, remarks that she would have made an ideal candidate for canonization in the Popular Front era of the 1930s, as her brand of radicalism was then becoming back into fashion. But her last real rallies had been a generation ago by that time. It wouldn't be until the countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s that Mother Jones was revived as a figure less of misty folklore than vibrant history in the American mainstream. By 1924, she could no longer even hold a pen betwixt her fingers, yet she continued to make public appearances, her last in support of striking dressmakers that year in Chicago, hundreds of whom were arrested and blacklisted for organizing. On what was celebrated as her 100th birthday in 1930, she was recorded for about 34 seconds on one of those newfangled talkie-type moving picture cameras. Unfortunately for a woman renowned in her time for her passion and fire and sense of drama, it really is a shame that this is the only instance we have of her actual voice. Mother Jones was a woman of her times, definitely. I don't find her skepticism of the suffragette movement particularly persuasive, though I do think she had and has a point and deserves hearing out, which is why I quoted her. She was wedded to the idea of very traditional gender roles, and I don't just mean in how she acted or dressed, but in her aims. Men working in dignity and compensated well enough to support a family, including a wife, on one income, just as nature supposedly intended. And though she did try to trick a group of armed miners with a non-existent telegram, it's possible, if unknowable ultimately, that she believed the risk worth it, if it might save these men lives to fight another day. You can't fight City Hall, after all. Her autobiography, never a smashed hit, riddled with inaccuracies as well as omissions and exaggerations, and quoted here sparingly, also smells pretty firmly of her life and times in the worst possible way. But, in many ways, she was a woman very ahead of her times, too, and that autobiography will come back in fashion during the 60s and 70s. Her early willingness to encourage strikes and solidarity among the proto-labor movement was not at all the norm when she first got involved, for one thing, and she fought early and often over what she perceived as cowardice or accommodationism among labor leaders and capitalists. While not above using the language and concepts of Christianity to spread her message, she was also keenly aware and keenly spoke on how churches of her era refused to preach against the brutality of their congregates' working conditions and of the hollowness of their spirituality. She found that by playing a caricature, she could paradoxically enjoy greater freedom to fight for a worker-centered world that was dominated by men, and that those men, really all men, really pretty much all people everywhere, long, in some sense, for a mother, one who cares about them, encourages them, stands with them, and shows them what courage really can look like when it's demonstrated by someone who has looked into the eyes of death and is not afraid. There is also a magazine called Mother Jones that I do not care for. Thank you for listening. Remember, patreon.com/dissidentpeasant, paypal.me/dissidentpeasant. See you